For months after Frank Hartwell died, his brother Donald showed up at the front door with a realtor named Cary who wore a sport coat despite it being 80 degrees and smelled of something cedar adjacent that wasn't actually cedar. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Ellie had been expecting one of them eventually. She hadn't expected both at once, and she hadn't expected it this soon. Donald was 66 years old, 2 years younger than Frank, and he carried himself with the particular manner of a man who believed the world owed him a small daily courtesy that it kept forgetting to pay. He hugged her at the door the way men hug women they've never quite known what to do with one arm, brief, already stepping past her into the front hall before the embrace had technically finished. "Ellie," he said her name like a full sentence. "You're looking good. You doing okay?" Sheila sends her love. She would have come, but she had the thing with her knee. Sheila's knee had a long and convenient history of flaring up at significant moments. Ellie had noticed this across 40 years of knowing the woman and had long since stopped remarking on it. Cary the realtor was nodding at things. The ceiling, the baseboards, the trim around the window in the front parlor. The way Cary nodded at her house made Ellie want to put her body between him and it. She offered them coffee, because she had been raised in a house where you offered people coffee regardless of how you felt about the people, and they sat around her kitchen table, and Donald got to it faster than she'd expected. "Gary's done a thorough comp analysis on the property," Donald said. He slid a folder across the table as if they were colleagues in a meeting. "Based on what's moved in the area this year, you're looking at something in the range of 280, maybe 290 if we time it right and do a few small updates. Kitchen hardware, fresh paint on the trim. Nothing major." Ellie looked at Cary. Cary turned his laptop to show her a color-coded spreadsheet. 3 neighboring properties listed down the left column with small photographs and sale prices. "I'm not selling the house, Donald." Donald smiled the way people smile when they've anticipated the objection and already composed their rebuttal. "Nobody's saying you have to. We're just saying you have options. The taxes alone on this place, and carrying it on your own without Frank's, I know what the taxes are. I've been paying them for 22 years. Frank handled most of. Frank handed me the checkbook and I wrote the checks. It's the same thing." Cary closed the laptop slightly. Donald's smile held but changed texture. She had seen this shift in him across 4 decades of family dinners and holidays, and one funeral the move from affable to deliberate, the point where pleasantness became a strategy rather than a mood. She let them stay 20 minutes. Offered a refill on the coffee. Got one herself, though she didn't want it, because standing at the counter gave her hands something to do. Donald talked about market timing and carrying costs and the sensible thing for a woman on her own to consider seriously. Cary said very little. The house said nothing, but she felt it around her, all of it the pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where she and Frank had tracked their son's heights every birthday until the boys got too old to want tracking. The garden going to seed through the back window, because she hadn't been able to find the will to tend it the way it needed. The bird feeder on the cedar post that Frank had painted the summer before, the cardinal coming to it every morning without knowing that the man who'd hung it was gone. She got them out by 11. She stood at the window and watched Donald's truck back down the drive, and Gary's sedan follow it. And then she poured the rest of her coffee down the drain and stood at the kitchen sink for a while, looking at nothing in particular. Eleanor Hartwell had been born in a hollow outside Harlan, Kentucky in 1954, the third of 5 children, in a house her grandfather had cut from timber he'd milled on the property. Her father had worked the mines until his lungs wouldn't let him anymore, and her mother had worked everything else: the garden, the canning, the mending, the cooking, the accounts for a small dry goods store 3 days a week, without ever describing any of it as work. That was simply how things got done. Ellie had left Harlan at 19 for community college in Lexington, stayed 4 years, and come back east by 23 with a bookkeeping certificate and a clear understanding of 2 things: what she was good at and what she wasn't willing to put up with. She'd taken a job as reception and general office help at a veterinary practice in Clay County because the veterinarian, Dr. Alma Pruitt, had looked at her across the desk at the interview and said, "I don't need someone who went to the right school. I need someone who won't quit when things get complicated." Ellie had said she could promise that, and it had turned out to be a promise she kept for 3 decades. She was 25 when she met Frank Hartwell at the Clearfield County Fair. He was there with his friend Bobby Colson, eating something fried on a stick and arguing about baseball the way men argue about baseball, loud, opinionated, cheerfully wrong about most of it. Ellie was there with her sister June, and June saw Frank first and nudged her. What June saw was a tall man with a good face and a laugh you could hear from 30 feet. What Ellie saw, watching him from the other side of the midway, was the way he caught a paper cup a child dropped, before it hit the ground, and handed it back to the mother without making anything of it. Not to be seen. Not because anyone was watching. Small and automatic. The way things only are when they're part of a person's actual character. She'd thought, this one pays attention. They were married 11 months later in her mother's back garden. 23 guests, a borrowed tablecloth, and a lemon cake that listed slightly to the left because the baker's car had hit a pothole on Route 9. Frank had laughed when he saw the cake, not to make her feel better, not politely, but with his whole chest. The unself-conscious way he laughed at everything that genuinely struck him as funny, and she had thought at that moment, without any uncertainty, this is right. They moved to Tilden County in Virginia 3 years into the marriage when Frank was brought on by the regional power company. He started as a lineman and worked up to crew supervisor over 20 years, the kind of career path built on competence and showing up and not making excuses, the same 3 things he respected in everyone else. They built on a 2-acre parcel east of town. Frank did most of the finish work himself, laid the hardwood floors in the bedroom over one long Thanksgiving weekend with Bobby Colson's help and a borrowed nail gun, and it was in that house, in Tilden County, that they spent the better part of 40 years. Ellie had worked for Dr. Copeland's practice, eventually managing the front office and all the billing, until she retired at 68. Frank had retired the year before. They'd planned travel, the grandchildren who had started appearing in earnest, the vegetable garden expanded into something serious, the trip to Scotland Frank had promised since 1994. They'd gotten 5 months of it before the stroke took him on a Monday morning in March while he was reading the newspaper on the back porch. The doctors said he hadn't suffered. She believed them because she had to. Frank's mother, Irene Hartwell, had died 2 years before Frank. She'd been a small, sharp woman who'd run a careful household in Clay County for 60 years, the kind of woman who knew the value of everything she'd ever owned and kept meticulous records in a composition notebook in her kitchen drawer. She'd accumulated, across that lifetime of carefulness, a modest savings account, a parcel of land adjoining her house that 2 different developers had offered to buy over the years, and a set of antique furniture that had come from her own mother and was worth considerably more than anyone in the family had acknowledged. Donald and Sheila had been the ones on the ground in Clay County for Irene's final 3 months. They'd been the ones handling the day-to-day, the appointments, the groceries, the paperwork that needed signing while Irene's hands had gotten less steady. By the time Frank and Ellie had made the drive down for the funeral, the savings account had been consolidated and transferred. The land parcel had been deeded to Donald in a transaction dated 6 weeks before Irene died, and the antique furniture, every piece of it, had already been moved to Donald and Sheila's house in Roanoke. Frank had known something was wrong. He'd sat across from Donald the evening after the funeral and asked directly about the account. Donald had produced documents. Signed, notarized, legal. Frank had gone very still in the particular way he went still when he was working out the distance between what he wanted to say and what he was going to say. Later that night in the dark, lying beside Ellie, he'd said, she was alone with them for 3 months. He never raised it again. She'd asked him once why not, and he'd said that he already knew what Donald would say and he'd rather keep his blood pressure. What he hadn't said, what she understood only in the rearview mirror of everything that had come after, was that he hadn't trusted himself to stop where argument ended and something worse began. After Frank died, Donald and Sheila had been kind in the ways that cost nothing. Sheila organized the food the neighbors brought over. Donald managed the parking situation at the church. Their son Tyler was a pallbearer. Ellie had been grateful for all of it in a distant, muffled way, the way you're grateful for things when you're too deep inside grief to feel anything clearly. 3 weeks after the funeral, Sheila had called to ask about the yellow settee. It was a small camelback sofa that had belonged to Frank's grandmother, reupholstered once in the 1970s in a gold fabric that had aged to the color of old honey. It had sat in Ellie's front parlor since the week they'd married, when Irene had given it to them as a wedding gift. Sheila called it lovely and said she'd always admired it and mentioned that she was redoing the sitting room, and that it would complete the space beautifully, and offered to send someone to collect it so Ellie wouldn't have to deal with the logistics. Ellie said she'd think about it. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to hang up the phone. When Sheila called back the following week, Ellie said the settee was staying where it was. 2 days after that came a text from Donald. Not a call. A text, which Ellie read standing at the kitchen counter while her second cup of morning coffee was still hot, and which used words like estate planning and long-term sustainability and carrying costs for a single-income household, and ended with, of course, there's no pressure whatsoever, and which she did not answer. Then Cary with the color-coded spreadsheet, and the 280 to 290 estimate, and the drive out of her house. She stood at the window and watched their cars reach the end of the drive and turn, and she thought about Irene's composition notebook of careful records, and the land parcel that had belonged to a woman who'd spent 60 years being careful, and the furniture that was now in Roanoke, and she understood not for the first time, but more sharply than before that Donald and Sheila were not going to stop. The cedar chest had been in Frank's barn workshop for longer than she could clearly account for. It was old, lid-arched, built from aromatic red cedar, sitting on the second shelf of the workshop beneath a length of canvas Frank used to cover his power tools through winter. She'd seen it so many times across so many years that it had become invisible in the way objects become invisible when they've always been their furniture you stop registering because your eye expects it and moves past it automatically. She'd gone into the barn the week after the funeral looking for the pruning shears, which she'd acknowledged was irrational given that it was barely April, but grief does things to a person's logic, and she'd needed somewhere to point herself. Her eyes had moved across the workshop the usual way and landed on the chest, and she'd stopped. She'd gone over and tried the lid. Locked. A small iron keyhole in the hasp, made for a barrel key. She'd tried every key on Frank's workshop ring and found none that fit. Then she'd gone back to the house and located the pruning shears in the pantry, where she'd left them herself last October, and she hadn't returned to the barn for 3 weeks. The chest sat in her mind the way certain objects sit, carrying something you're not ready to look at, showing up in the gaps between other thoughts. She thought about it washing the supper dishes. She thought about it at the edge of sleep. Once she woke at 2 in the morning and lay there in the particular dark of a house that has lost one of its people, and she thought about the chest with a clarity that surprised her. In the top drawer of Frank's bedside table, she'd found a small wooden box during the week after the funeral, the kind with a sliding lid, and inside it, under his watch and his pocket knife, and a few foreign coins from a trip they'd taken in 2003, was a small key on a worn leather cord. The key was old and brass-colored, barrel type, the same general shape as the lock on the chest. She'd held it for a moment and then put it in her own drawer without quite acknowledging what she was doing. She'd known. She'd known it and not been ready. 4 months after the funeral, on a Wednesday in late July, with the heat sitting heavy and Donald's unanswered text still on her phone, and the cardinal at the feeder, and the settee still in the parlor exactly where it was going to stay, Ellie walked out to the barn. She lifted the canvas off the cedar chest. She fitted the small brass key into the iron hasp. It turned on the first try. The smell when she lifted the lid was cedar and old paper and something metallic underneath, faint, like machine oil or worked brass. She stood over the open chest and looked inside. On top, a letter, folded twice, written on the heavy cream stationery Frank used for things that mattered. Her name on the outside in his handwriting, the handwriting she'd read for 44 years across grocery lists and birthday cards, and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter when he'd gotten up before her. Below the letter, a set of documents held with a rubber band, aged and faded, the paper gone soft at the folds. And below those, in the center of the chest on a square of cloth, a brass key, larger than the one she'd used to open the lid. Heavier, with a long barrel and a square bow, the kind she'd seen only in antique stores and old photographs. She took the letter. She sat down on the barn floor with her back against the workbench and her knees pulled to her chest, and she unfolded it. Frank's handwriting started the way Frank started everything, directly, without working up to it. Ellie, it began. If you're reading this, I've run out of time to tell you this myself, and I'm sorry for that. I should have told you years ago. I kept waiting for the right moment, which is another way of saying I was afraid, which is another way of saying I'm a stubborn man, and you already knew that, and are probably not surprised. His grandfather, he wrote, had owned a piece of land in Boone County. Not the family house, she knew, not the place where Irene had raised them. A separate parcel, a few acres in the foothills east of a town called Creel's Crossing, with an old farmhouse and a barn that had been sitting empty since before Frank was born. It had passed to Frank's father, who paid it no mind, and then to Frank and Donald jointly when their father died, along with a tax debt against it that made the whole thing feel like a problem rather than an asset. Donald had pushed to sell it in 1994. Frank had refused. He bought out Donald's half instead, for $1,000 from their joint savings account, paid in cash, without telling her, and he was sorry for the secrecy, he wrote. He'd been afraid she'd object to spending the money, and he'd been right that she would have objected, and he was sorry. But he needed to hold on to that land. His grandfather Emmett had been the one person in his family who had spoken to him as if what he thought was worth hearing, and the land had been Emmett's, and that had been enough of a reason at the time, even if it was hard to explain. He'd gone out to the property once, in 1987, when she'd thought he was on a fishing weekend with Bobby Colson. He'd gone alone to see what was there, and what he'd found below the barn in a cellar he hadn't known existed had unsettled him badly enough that he'd sealed the door and driven home and not told anyone. He'd sealed it himself, he wrote. He'd put a padlock on the cellar door and hadn't gone back. He knew that wasn't right. He knew she was going to have some things to say about 30-some years of not going back, and he deserved all of them. The brass key in the chest opened the cellar door. The property documents were also in the chest. He'd had the deed redrawn 3 years ago and put it in her name only. The date on the notarization was 2021, 2 years before he died, and the address at the top was a county road number in Boone County she didn't recognize. "Whatever is down there is yours," he had written at the bottom of the 3rd page, in the slightly looser hand of a man finishing a long letter. "It has always been yours. I was scared of it, and I waited, and I'm sorry for the waiting. I should have trusted you with it. I should have trusted you with it the moment I found it. You were always the braver one." She sat on the barn floor for a long time after that, with the letter in her lap and the brass key in her hand. Outside, the heat was at its peak, the kind of heavy Virginia July heat that presses down on everything. She could hear the cardinal at the feeder. She could hear the particular silence of the barn around her, the way old wood and stored tools hold quiet differently than a house does. She turned the brass key over in her fingers. It was heavier than it looked. The bow was hand-forged, slightly irregular, and there was a set of small initials stamped into the barrel that she held up to the light coming through the barn's single dusty window. E.H., they read. 2 letters. Emmett Hartwell, she supposed. Frank's grandfather. She looked at the documents in the chest. The deed on top, her name typed and notarized. A county road in Boone County, acreage described in the old way with compass bearings and natural markers. A property that had been sitting on a hill in eastern Kentucky for 30-odd years with a locked cellar beneath its barn and whatever Frank had found and sealed inside it in 1987. She folded the letter carefully back along its original creases and set it in the inside pocket of her cardigan, close to her chest. She picked up the brass key and the deed and stood up from the barn floor, brushing sawdust from the back of her jeans. There was a phone call she needed to make. Not to Donald. Not to her sons. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was dealing with. Her friend Ruth McKay, who lived 4 miles up the county road and had driven her to every doctor's appointment in the month after Frank's death and had never once made her feel like a burden for it. Ruth, who had a truck and a steady head, and who Ellie trusted the way you trust people who have shown you, across many years and several difficult moments, exactly who they are. She walked back to the house with the deed in one hand and the brass key in the other. She had a long drive to plan. Ruth McKay answered on the 2nd ring, which was how Ruth answered most things promptly, without ceremony, already present. "I need to take a drive," Ellie said. "Boone County. I don't know how long we'd be gone. Could be 1 night, could be 2. I'd explain on the way." There was a brief pause. Not hesitation. Ruth didn't hesitate. Just the sound of a woman setting something down and giving her full attention to the conversation. "When do you want to leave?" "Tomorrow morning, if you can. I'll be there at 7 with coffee. You want me to bring anything else?" Ellie thought about the brass key in her cardigan pocket and the deed with an address she didn't recognize, and Frank's 3-page letter telling her he'd been scared of something for 30 years and asking her to go find out what it was. "Bring the things you'd bring if you weren't sure what you were walking into," she said. Ruth didn't ask what that meant. She just said she'd see her at 7 and hung up, which was one of the 40 or 50 reasons Ellie had trusted this woman for 31 years. They left at 7:15 the next morning in Ruth's truck, a 10-year-old Silverado that smelled of dog and weatherproof spray and had a crack across the lower passenger corner of the windshield that Ruth kept meaning to fix. Ellie had the deed on her lap and Frank's letter in her cardigan pocket. The brass key was in the front zipper pouch of her purse, which she kept between her feet on the floor mat. She told Ruth everything on the first hour of the drive, laying it out in order: the cedar chest, the leather cord key, the letter, the property in Boone County Frank had bought out from Donald in 1994 and never mentioned. The cellar, the sealed door. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was something Ellie had always valued about her. Some people listened while preparing their response. Ruth actually listened. When Ellie finished, Ruth said, "So Donald doesn't know about this property. As far as I can tell, Donald thinks Frank signed his half over in 1994, and that was the end of it. There's nothing in any of Frank's papers that mentions it." Ruth took a moment with that. "And Frank went out there once, found something, and locked it up and never said a word. Not a word. 36 years. Another moment. That's a long time to carry something." Ellie looked out the passenger window at the Virginia morning going by, the hills still green in late July, the fence lines and the farm stands, and the occasional church on a rise. She'd lain awake most of the night with that same thought turning in her mind. 36 years of Frank sitting across the breakfast table, of Frank reaching for her hand in the car, of Frank laughing at the tilted cake on their anniversary when she got one made the same way each year as a joke. Between them, 36 years of all of it, and this one sealed thing sitting in him the whole time. She wasn't angry. She'd checked herself for anger and found mostly something else, a complicated thing she couldn't fully name. That was partly grief, and partly the strange tenderness of discovering that someone you loved had a fear. Frank had been a man who was good at most things, and she had known that. And somewhere underneath all that capability had been one thing that scared him enough that he locked a door in 1987 and drove home without looking back. She'd spent 4 months wishing she could ask him one more question. Now she at least knew which question it would have been. The drive to Boone County took just over 3 hours. They crossed into Kentucky in the late morning, the hills getting steeper and the roads narrower in the way of eastern Kentucky roads, and they stopped in a town called Cellar to eat lunch at a diner with a handwritten menu board and a woman behind the counter who refilled their coffee without being asked. Ellie showed the address on the deed to the woman when she brought the check. The county road number. Creel's Crossing. It said in parentheses beneath it. The woman looked at it. Creel's Crossing. She said it the way locals say the names of places they know well, without emphasis, just recognition. "That's about 14 miles east. You take the main road out past the feed store, follow the signs for the watershed, and Creel's Crossing Road forks off to the right before the bridge. Most of that land out there hasn't had anybody on it in years." Ellie thanked her. She left a tip that was larger than the bill. Back in the truck, Ruth followed the directions, and the road narrowed further as they went east, the hills closing around them, timber and stands of old growth mixed with cleared pasture going brown at the edges in the summer heat. A creek ran alongside the road for a stretch and then disappeared under it, and came out the other side. A hawk sat on a fence post and watched them pass without moving. The sign for Creel's Crossing Road was weathered to near illegibility, white letters on a green ground, half hidden behind a stand of elderberry that had grown up against the post. Ruth almost missed it. She caught it in the mirror, reversed on the empty road, and turned. The lane was gravel, packed hard by what must have been decades of use, and then left to compact further by years of disuse. Trees on both sides, tall enough that the road was mostly in shadow even at noon. A quarter-mile in, a mailbox. Rusted, tilted on its post, no name visible. Beyond it, a long dirt track going up through a stand of old apple trees that hadn't been pruned in so long they'd gone half-wild, their lower branches touching the ground, their upper branches knit together overhead. Ruth put the truck in low and they went up the track. The farmhouse came into view around a bend, and both of them went quiet. It was 2 stories, timber-framed, the kind of bones you could see even under 40 years of weather and neglect. The roof had held better than Ellie had expected, sagged in one place over the south end of the house, but intact. The porch had lost most of its railing and 2 of its posts, and the front steps had settled at an angle, but the floor of the porch was still there. The windows were shuttered on the ground floor, real wood shutters, old ones, latched from the outside. The siding had weathered to a silver gray that caught the midday light and gave the house an odd quality, something between ruin and intention, as if the weathering was a choice rather than an accident. The apple trees pressed close on both sides. Decades of fruit had fallen and rotted and composted into the grass around the foundation, and the smell of it came through the truck's open windows, sweet and earthy, the smell of something that had been left to complete its own long process without interference. Ruth turned off the engine. They sat there for a moment, both looking at it. "Frank's grandfather built this?" Ruth asked. "I assume so. From what Frank wrote, the property's been in the family since at least the 1920s. Ruth looked at the roofline, the angle of the porch posts, the shuttered windows. "It's old. Older than the 20s, maybe." Ellie had the same feeling. She'd looked at enough old buildings across a lifetime in rural Virginia and Kentucky to know the difference between a house from the 30s and a house from before the century turned, and this one had the proportions of the earlier period. The pitch of the roof, the width of the porch, the spacing of the windows, which was off by modern standards but correct for a time when glass was expensive and small panes were what you could get. She got out of the truck. The air smelled of timber and creek water and the apple trees, and the grass around the house was knee-high and going to seed. She walked to the front porch steps and stood at the bottom and put one foot on the lowest step and pushed down to test it. It held. She went up carefully, both hands ready, but the porch floor was solid underfoot old heart pine, she thought, tight-grained and dense, the kind of wood that outlasts the people who laid it by a century if you keep the weather off it. The shutters on the front windows were latched with simple iron hooks. She unlatched the nearest one, and it swung open, the hinges grinding with rust but moving. Afternoon light fell through the glass, which was old glass, slightly wavy, the kind that made the view through it look like a reflection in water. The largest of the 3 keys on Frank's key ring fit the front door lock. It turned hard, with effort, and the door opened inward on a darkness that smelled of old wood and cold air and the particular stillness of a house that has held its breath for a long time. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She didn't go in yet. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust and looked at what she could see from there. A front room, low-ceilinged, with wide plank floors. A stone fireplace on the north wall, the mantel still in place. A staircase, the banister intact. No furniture. The house had been emptied at some point, or perhaps had never been furnished, or perhaps the furniture had been removed carefully by someone who intended to come back. But the house itself was there. The bones of it, the structure, what a carpenter or a builder would look at and call the thing that matters. She stepped back from the door. The barn was 30 yards behind the house, set slightly downhill, connected to it by a stone path that was still mostly visible through the overgrown grass. It was smaller than the farmhouse, lower, built from the same weathered timber. The doors were large sliding doors, the kind made for moving livestock and equipment, hung on a track that had rusted in place years ago. They didn't slide, but one of them had come off the lower guide and could be pulled outward at the base to make a gap wide enough to walk through. Ruth pulled it. The gap opened. They went in. The inside of the barn was cool after the July heat outside, the kind of cool that stone foundations and heavy timber hold through a summer. Light came through gaps in the siding in long, thin bars that moved when a breeze pushed through, catching the dust that rose from the floor as they walked. The floor itself was packed earth, hard as concrete, swept at some point by someone who cared about the condition of the space and left in the kind of order that only seems accidental. On the south wall, pegs for tools, most of them empty. A workbench along the east wall, solid, hand-built, with a wooden jaw vise at one end that still moved when Ruth tried it. A stack of old lumber against the far corner, oak boards, rough cut, dried to the color of bone. Everything arranged by a person who thought in terms of where things should be and put them there with intention. Ellie walked slowly down the center of the barn, looking. At the far end, past where a stall partition had once divided the space, the floor dropped slightly. Not a dramatic drop 2 or 3 inches, the kind of change in grade you'd feel in your step before you saw it. She stopped. She looked at the far wall. It was stone, like the foundation walls on the other 3 sides, fieldstone laid without mortar in the old way, each stone chosen for fit, the whole thing held together by the weight and precision of the arrangement. But on the far right side of that wall, down low, almost at floor level, there was something that wasn't wall. A door. Small, she'd have to duck to go through it, and Frank would have had to duck considerably more. Wood, black with age, set flush with the stone so that you'd miss it entirely if you weren't looking for it, and maybe miss it even if you were. The iron hinges were hand-forged, heavy, the strap type that ran almost the full width of the door. A bar hasp on the right side, with a padlock through it. The padlock was old, a large brass cylinder lock that had weathered to the same dull color as everything else in the barn, and if you weren't standing in front of it in full light you might take it for part of the stonework. Ruth came to stand beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The padlock had a keyhole in the bottom. A barrel lock. The same type as the hasp on the cedar chest. Ellie already knew what she was going to find before she opened her purse and took out the zipper pouch and removed the brass key with the initials EH stamped into the barrel. She held it up. Ruth looked at it, and then at the lock. He sealed it himself, Ellie said. In 1987. He wrote that he came out here alone and found something and sealed the door. Ruth looked at the door again. The way she looked at it was the way a person looks at something when they're trying to decide how they feel about it before they know what it contains. Whatever's in there has been in there since 1987. Since before that. Frank found it. He didn't put it there. She crouched down and looked more closely at the door. The wood was old, much older than the barn around it, she thought. The planks were wider than any plank lumber available after about 1900, each one 9 or 10 inches across, the edges hand-planked. The iron hinges had a quality to them she recognized from old buildings she'd seen across a lifetime in rural Kentucky, the particular weight and proportion of hand-forged iron made in a time before the ratio of labor to material had changed. This door was older than the barn. The barn had been built around it. She stayed crouched there for a long moment, studying it, the brass key loose in her hand. The cool air was coming from somewhere, she could feel it faintly at floor level, rising from beneath the door. It smelled of mineral and dark earth and something else underneath that she couldn't immediately name. Old wood? Metal? Something specific, not quite either, that she associated in a distant way with her grandfather's smokehouse when she was a child, the smell of things kept in intentional darkness for a long time. She could hear Ruth breathing behind her. She could hear the barn settling around them, the small sounds old timber makes in afternoon heat. She straightened up. Not yet. She needed to be steady before she did this, and she wasn't entirely steady. She turned around and walked back toward the open barn door, out into the July sunlight, and stood there for a moment with her face tilted up and her eyes closed, just breathing. Ruth came out behind her. You don't have to do it today, Ruth said. I know. We could get a room in Kessler. Sleep on it. Come back in the morning when you've had a night to sit with this. Ellie opened her eyes. She looked back at the barn and then at the farmhouse above it on the rise, and at the old apple trees with their wild branches, and at the hill behind the property going up into timber that she couldn't see the top of. She thought about Frank in 1987, 27 years younger, standing exactly where she was standing now. She thought about what he'd written. I was scared of it, and I waited. She thought about the 36 years between that moment and the letter she'd read on the barn floor in Virginia. She'd always been the braver one. He'd said so himself. Before they left for the night, a truck came down the lane. It was older than Ruth's, a 1980s Dodge in faded red, going carefully on the gravel, and it stopped at the edge of the apple tree stand rather than coming closer, the way people in the country stop at the boundary of someone else's land. The man who got out was in his late 70s. Short, broad in the shoulders, wearing a blue shirt with the sleeves rolled and work boots that had the look of tools used daily rather than for show. He had white hair cut close and a face that had spent a lot of time in weather. He looked at them. He looked at the house and the barn. Saw a truck up the lane, he said. Haven't seen a truck up that lane in 30-some years. This was Emmett Hartwell's land, Ellie said. Frank Hartwell was his grandson. I was Frank's wife. The old man studied her for a moment. Frank's past. March. He took that in. I'm Cary Oaks. My family's farmed the next parcel over since before I was born. I knew Emmett Hartwell well enough. Knew of Frank, though I didn't know him personally. Emmett talked about him sometimes. He paused. He talked about this place, too. said someday the right person would come back to it. Ellie looked at the man carefully. What did he say about it? Cary Oakes looked at the barn for a moment in the late afternoon light. Then he looked back at her. He said there was something here that was meant to stay in the family. Something he'd put away that he wasn't ready to let the world have yet. A small pause. He said he'd know who to leave it to when the time came. Ellie had the brass key in her hand, she realized. She'd been holding it since they came out of the barn. She hadn't noticed. Did he ever tell you what it was? She asked. Cary Oakes shook his head. Emmett Hartwell was a man who kept his own counsel. I asked once. He said some things were meant to be found by the right hands at the right time, and that the only thing worse than keeping a secret was telling it too soon. He looked at the key in her hand. Looks like maybe the time came. He got back in his truck without asking any other questions. Before he pulled away, he rolled the window down and looked back at her. If you need anything while you're out here, he said, I'm the second driveway past the watershed sign. I've got tools, and I've got time, and I knew Emmett, which might count for something. He drove back up the lane and was gone. Ruth and Ellie stood in the cooling afternoon air and listened to the gravel settle after his tires had left it, and the birds that had gone quiet when the truck came starting up again in the apple trees. Tomorrow morning, Ellie said. Ruth nodded. I'll call ahead to the motel in Cellar. Ellie looked at the barn one more time. At the plain gray exterior and the dark gap where the door was pulled out of its guide. At the building that had stood on this hill for 100 years holding whatever Emmett Hartwell had put away and considered too important for the wrong moment. She closed her fingers around the brass key. She'd waited 4 months to open the cedar chest. She could wait one more night for this. But only one. She woke at 5:15 without an alarm. The motel room in Cellar was clean and plain, 2 double beds and a window unit that had cycled off sometime in the night. And Ellie lay there for a few minutes in the early gray light listening to Ruth breathe from the other bed and looking at the ceiling. She wasn't groggy. She'd slept well, which surprised her, and woken to a clarity that felt less like morning alertness than like the particular sharpness of a person who has made a decision and is ready to move toward it. She got up and dressed without turning the overhead light on, made coffee from the small machine on the dresser, stood at the window with the cup in both hands, and watched the sky over the hills go from gray to pale gold in the east. Ruth stirred at 6, was dressed and drinking her own coffee by 6:15 without conversation, the way Ruth did things, efficiently and without performance. They were back in the truck by 6:40. The road to Creel's crossing was different at that hour, quieter, the light coming in at a low angle through the timber on both sides, the creek alongside the road catching it and throwing it back in pieces. Ellie watched the landscape pass and didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with anything. Ruth drove with one hand on the wheel and her coffee in the other and the windows down an inch, and the morning air came through cool and smelled of dew and creek water, and somewhere behind all of it the sweetness of the apple trees waiting up the lane. Cary Oakes's truck was already parked at the base of the Hartwell Drive when they got there. He was sitting on the tailgate in the early morning, a thermos in his hand, wearing the same blue shirt from the day before. He brought a canvas bag of tools. She could see the handles of various things and 2 battery-powered work lanterns, the kind that give off a steady white light good for close detail work. Figured you'd be back early, he said when Ruth pulled up beside him. And I figured a cellar that's been sealed 30-odd years might benefit from some decent light. Ellie got out of the truck. You didn't have to come. No, he agreed, without elaborating. He picked up the lanterns and the tool bag and started up the lane through the apple trees without waiting, and Ellie and Ruth followed him. They stood in front of the cellar door for a moment before Ellie did anything. The barn in morning light was different from the barn in afternoon light. The low sun came through the gaps in the siding at a different angle and caught the dust motes in the air and lit the packed earth floor in long sections, and the far wall with the door set into it was partly in shadow and partly in that early light. And the door itself looked exactly as it had the afternoon before, old, dark, patient, as if waiting were something it had long since stopped noticing. Cary set one of the lanterns on the floor and turned it on. The white light filled the end of the barn steadily. Ellie crouched in front of the padlock. This close, she could see the quality of it, a large cylinder lock, solid brass, the kind made to last rather than to be inexpensive, with a keyhole at the bottom that was clean despite 30 years of disuse. Someone had greased it at some point. Frank, she thought. Frank in 1987, putting the lock on with the care of a man who intended it to hold. She fitted the key. It turned. Not easily. She felt resistance and the slight grinding of a mechanism that hadn't moved in decades, but it turned. The shackle released with a sound like a small, definitive word. She pulled the lock free from the hasp and held it in her hand for a moment, feeling its weight, and then set it carefully on the barn floor to her right. The bar hasp swung open. She put both hands on the door and pulled. It came toward her with a sound that seemed to belong to another century: iron hinges and old wood. A long groan that filled the barn and then faded, and behind it, in the sudden opening where the door had been, a darkness and a cold that was immediate and absolute. The smell came out with the cold. Mineral, stone, dry earth, and underneath those things something she now recognized, the same something she'd half identified yesterday. Metal. Old worked metal, the smell of brass and iron, and perhaps silver, the smell of objects that had been sitting in cool, dry air for a very long time. Cary handed her one of the lanterns. She ducked through the opening. 3 stone steps went down. She counted them under her feet because the lantern light was still adjusting to the space, and she was being careful. At the bottom of the 3rd step, she straightened up. She was in a room. Not a passage, not a crawl space, not the rough dug dirt kind of cellar that might have been used for root vegetables, and nothing else. A room, with stone walls on all 4 sides laid in the same careful, mortarless fieldstone as the barn foundation above it, with a ceiling of heavy timber that was low enough that she kept her head slightly bent, and a floor of flat stone, fitted together with the same precision as the walls. Someone had built this. Not dug it, built it. Framed it, fitted it, sealed it. The lantern lit the space in stages. Along the left wall, a wooden cabinet, floor to ceiling, 6 feet wide, built from oak that had darkened with age to the color of old coffee. Its doors were closed and secured with a simple wooden turnbuckle. Along the right wall, a workbench lower than the one above, cleaner, built for something other than carpentry. On it, objects covered with oilcloth, the cloth stiff and dark with decades. A tin box with a hinged lid sitting in the center of the bench, not covered. A leather document wallet lying flat beside it, thick with papers. At the far end of the room, against the back wall, a low wooden shelf held 3 composition notebooks side by side, their covers warped slightly with age, and beside them a single framed photograph, face down. Ruth came through the doorway behind her. Then Cary, ducking lower than either of them. The second lantern came on, and the room filled with light. None of them spoke for a moment. Then Ellie moved. She went to the cabinet first, because it was the largest thing, and because some part of her understood that whatever was in it was the center of this room in the way a hearth is the center of a house. She turned the wooden latch and opened the doors. Inside, the shelves were fitted with shallow wooden trays, each tray lined with a dark green felt that had kept its color in the cool, dry air. And in the trays, arranged in rows with the precision of a person who cared about what they were keeping, were coins. Gold coins. She picked one up. It was heavy in a way that still surprised her, even knowing what it was: the specific density of gold, which is unlike the weight of any other metal, that sits in the palm with a different kind of authority. The coin was a double eagle, $20 face value, and on the obverse Lady Liberty strode forward with a torch in one hand and an olive branch in the other, the capital behind her, the sun rising at the edge of the design. She turned it over. An eagle in flight, the date below, 1924. St. Gaudens's design. She knew the coin because Frank had shown her one, once, at an antique shop in Roanoke, and said it was the most beautiful coin ever made by an American mint, and she had agreed with him. She looked at the trays. She counted the rows carefully, moving the lantern. 12 trays, each holding between 25 and 30 coins, some double eagles, some Liberty Head 20s, dated from 1900 through 1932. She didn't count every coin, but she counted enough to know the total was somewhere above 300. She set the coin down gently, precisely, back in its place in the felt. She turned to the workbench. The tin box opened without a lock. Inside, currency, banded in stacks, old bills with the look of paper money from the Depression era, faded but intact and dry. A rough count put it near $12,000 in face value. Beneath the currency, 7 bond series E-war bonds, dated 1943 through 1945, each one made out to Emmett Hartwell, none of them ever redeemed. And beneath the bonds, 3 handwritten notes on plain paper, each one a promissory letter from a neighboring family acknowledging a loan from Emmett Hartwell during the years 1931 through 1934. The amounts were small $50, $80, $40, and beside each amount, in different handwriting, a single word, forgiven. He'd never collected. He'd forgiven every debt and kept the notes anyway, not as leverage, but as a record of what had passed between him and his neighbors during the hardest years, the kind of record a man keeps because he wants to remember that people had needed him and that he had been able to help. Ellie held one of the notes for a moment, then laid it back carefully. She picked up the leather document wallet. The papers inside were folded into sections and wrapped with a length of ribbon that had once been red and was now the pale brown of old ribbon. She unwrapped it and unfolded the first document. It was a land grant. Original, handwritten, dated 1887, transferring 847 acres in Boone County, Kentucky, to one Thomas Merritt Hartwell, Emmett's father, she calculated. 3 generations back. The description of the land ran for 2 full pages in the cramped hand of a county surveyor, compass bearings and natural markers and creek names, and what it described was not the few acres of the current property, but a holding that stretched from the creek at the foot of the hill up through the timber to the ridge and down the far side, and along a second creek for nearly 2 miles. 847 acres. She stood at the workbench and looked at that number and looked at the property outside where they stood the few acres around the farmhouse and the barn and the apple trees and understood that what she was holding was the original, what the family had once had before 3 generations of division and sale and difficulty had reduced it to what remained. She kept reading. The next document was a deed, 1924, transferring a portion of the original land grant. Then another, 1931, a forced sale of 412 acres during the Depression, the price ruinously low, the kind of transaction that happened everywhere in those years when a family couldn't pay its taxes and had no other choice. Then a 1947 document from the county, a condemnation notice for an additional 90 acres for a watershed project, with a note handwritten in the margin in Emmett's hand. Did not sign. Do not accept. Below the condemnation notice, the county's subsequent correspondence, for letters across as many years, each one noting that Emmett Hartwell had declined to respond to the acquisition notice. And then nothing after 1951. The county had stopped writing. She did the arithmetic slowly, because she wanted to be sure. 847 acres minus the 1931 for sale minus the small parcels sold earlier left 340 acres that Emmett had held through the Depression and through the county's attempt to take the watershed land, and through every other pressure that had come. 340 acres that had never been legally transferred, that were still in the name of Emmett Ray Hartwell on the original deed. And below the deeds, folded separately, a set of mineral rights documents, dated 1953, from a coal company that had approached Emmett about the hillside above the property. He had read them. Clearly the margins were filled with his handwriting and had set them aside and signed. But the documents themselves confirmed what the company already knew. The hill behind the farmhouse sat above a significant coal seam, and below that, natural gas deposits. Emmett had known what was in the hill. He had chosen not to sell. Ruth was standing at her shoulder. Ellie hadn't heard her approach. Ellie. She looked up. Sit down for a minute. She hadn't realized she needed to sit down until Ruth said it, and then she understood that her legs were not entirely steady. She lowered herself onto the stone step at the base of the stairs and put the document wallet on her lap and sat there in the lantern light with the cool air around her and breathed. Cary Oakes had taken the framed photograph from the shelf at the far end of the room and turned it face up. He looked at it for a long moment and then carried it over and handed it to her without comment. It was a photograph of a man, black and white, taken outdoors. He was standing in front of the barn. She recognized the door frame behind him, and he was looking at the camera with the direct gaze of a person who didn't feel the need to arrange their expression for a photograph. He was perhaps 60 in the image, broad-shouldered, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hands at his sides were the hands of someone who had worked with them all his life. On the back of the frame, in the same handwriting she'd seen in the margin notes, for whoever finds this place. Emmett R. Hartwell, 1961. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she reached for the composition notebooks. Emmett Hartwell had not been a man who wrote easily or at length, and the journals showed it. The entries were short, practical, written in the terse hand of a person who was recording things because they needed to be recorded rather than because he enjoyed the act of writing. But across 3 notebooks, from 1945 through 1963, the shape of a life and a decision emerged with the clarity of something that had never been dressed up. He had accumulated the gold coins across 40 years, buying them a few a day, at a time from banks and dealers and private sellers, because he had watched the Depression take everything his neighbors had, and he did not trust paper promises. He had kept the land because the land was real, and because his father had worked it and his grandfather before that, and because no company or county or piece of paper that arrived in the mail had the right to it in his understanding of things. He had sealed the cellar in the early 1960s when his son Frank's father, Raymond, had started making the kind of financial decisions that Emmett recognized as the decisions of a man who would trade long value for short comfort. He didn't write this harshly. He wrote, "Raymond is not a careful man. He writes it once and doesn't repeat it." He wrote, "I have grandchildren. I do not know what they will be yet. I am going to put this away until I know." He wrote, in an entry dated 1963, his last entry in the final notebook, "I am going to leave the key where I leave the things I trust. The boy who reads will find it. The boy who doesn't read won't know to look." She stopped at that sentence and sat with it for a moment. The boy who reads. Frank, who had spent his childhood reading everything in reach, who still had books on every surface of their house when he died, who read the newspaper every morning of his adult life, and who had been the first in his family to finish high school and the first to go to college. Emmett had left the key inside a book. She'd bet her life on it. Frank had found it, followed it here, and been faced with a room full of things he didn't know how to carry. He'd been 24 years old. He'd sealed the door and gone home, and spent 36 years figuring out how to hand it on to someone who could handle it. He'd handed it to her. She called her son David from the farmhouse porch in the late morning, sitting in the old rocking chair she and Ruth had found inside, still solid, just dusty. She told him where she was and what she had found, and David, who was 42 and an accountant in Portland and had inherited his father's quality of listening without interrupting, heard her through to the end and then said, very quietly, "Mom, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm better than fine. But I need the name of a good attorney in Kentucky, and I need to know how to reach someone who can authenticate gold coins and historical land documents, and I need you to not tell your Uncle Donald anything until I say so." There was a pause. "Did Uncle Donald do something?" David asked. "Your Uncle Donald," Ellie said carefully, "bought his half of this property from your father for $4,000 in 1994 because he thought it was worthless. I want to know exactly how worthless it is before we have that conversation." What followed across the next 3 weeks was the kind of work that Ellie had always done while methodical, thorough, unhurried. The work of a woman who had kept the books for 30 years and understood that the value of anything depended on knowing precisely what you had. Cary Oaks drove her to the county recorder's office in the Boone County seat on the second day, and she spent 4 hours with a land records clerk named Beverly who had been in that office for 23 years and who pulled the original Hartwell land grant without blinking and confirmed what the documents in the cellar showed. 340 acres of Hartwell land had never been legally transferred. The county's 1947 watershed acquisition had failed when Emmett declined to respond, and the county had quietly abandoned the effort in 1951 rather than pursue condemnation proceedings against a man who clearly knew what he had. The land was in Emmett's name, and through the succession of deeds Frank had placed in the Cedar chest, it was now in Ellie's. The attorney David connected her with was a woman named Carla Fugate in Lexington, 50s, with a direct manner and the specific competence of someone who had handled rural property disputes for 30 years and was not surprised by anything that came out of eastern Kentucky hillsides. She drove to Creel's Crossing on the third day, walked the property with Ellie and Cary, read the documents in the cellar with a focused attention that reminded Ellie of the way good diagnosticians read an X-ray, and said, "This is going to take some time to fully work out, but I can tell you right now that you own 340 acres of Boone County that no one knew belonged to anyone in the last 60 years. That land has timber value, mineral rights value, and assessed land value, and we are going to establish all three with the correct experts before anyone hears a word about any of this." The coin appraiser came from Louisville, a man named Douglas Fair, referred by a colleague of David's, who ran a numismatics and precious metals firm and who arrived on the 5th day with white cotton gloves and a magnifying loupe and a practiced absence of visible reaction to anything. He spent 3 hours in the cellar with the coin trays, examining each one, making notes on a yellow legal pad. And when he was done, he sat across from Ellie at the kitchen table in the farmhouse. Ruth had swept the floor and found a table and 4 chairs in an upstairs room that were still sound, and he opened his notes. He counted 341 coins. 87 were Liberty Head double eagles from 1900 through 1907. 203 were St. Gaudens double eagles, the most recognized and collectible design in American coinage, struck between 1907 and 1932. 51 were other gold coins of various denominations and dates, all pre-1933. The condition of the collection, stored in dry, cool air on felt in a sealed stone room, was extraordinary. At current gold spot price, the melt value of the collection was just over $1.1 million. With numismatic premiums applied to the condition and rarity of the key dates in the St. Gaudens series, the full appraised value was between $1.4 and $1.9 million, depending on how the collection was sold. If placed with a major auction house as a single-owner collection with documented provenance, the high end was achievable. Ellie wrote those numbers down on a piece of paper and looked at them for a moment, and then folded the paper and put it in her cardigan pocket with Frank's letter. The mineral rights assessment came 2 weeks later from an energy consulting firm Feud retained. 2 geologists spent 3 days on the hillside with equipment and came back with a report that confirmed the 1953 coal company's assessment and updated it with 60 years of additional geological data. The coal seam was shallower than profitable surface mining would require, but the natural gas deposit below it was a different matter. Proved reserves across the 340 acres were conservatively estimated at between $3.2 and $4.8 million in extraction rights value, depending on current market rates and the terms negotiated with any extraction company. Feud advised immediately that they were not required to sell the extraction rights and that a lease arrangement was worth exploring. Ellie said she wanted to understand all the options before she decided anything, and Carla said that was exactly right. The war bonds, with accrued interest calculated at the applicable Series E rate, came to $18,400. Modest against the rest of it. But Ellie thought about the 1943 date on the earliest bond and the age Emmett would have been in that year and what it meant for a working farmer to put money into bonds during a war, and she set the amount in a separate category in her mind from the rest. The timberland value of the 340 acres, assessed by a forestry appraiser, came to $680,000. She sat with all of the numbers on a Wednesday evening, alone at the table in the farmhouse with the lantern light and the sound of the summer night coming through the open window, and she added them. The total, conservatively calculated, was between $5.9 and $7.4 million. She called Donald on a Thursday morning. She did it from the farmhouse porch, in the rocking chair, with the apple trees in front of her going through their slow late summer process and the birds in them going about their business. She had not planned a long conversation. She knew what she needed to say, and she said it directly, the way Frank would have. She told him she'd been at the old Boone County property. She told him she'd found Emmett's sealed cellar. She told him what was in it. She did not give him numbers. She didn't need to. She could hear, in the quality of the silence on the other end of the line, that Donald was doing the arithmetic himself, what he'd sold Frank his half of for in 1994, what he had thought was there, what had actually been there the whole time. When he finally spoke, his voice had a flatness to it she hadn't heard from him before. Frank knew, he said. Not a question. Frank found it in 1987, she said. He sealed it. He left it to me. Another silence. I need to think, Donald said. You take all the time you need, Ellie said. She ended the call and set the phone on the porch railing. In the apple trees, a wren was working through the branches with focused efficiency, pulling at things, moving on. The morning was already warm and going warmer. She could hear Ruth in the kitchen behind her, the sound of the kettle, the particular domestic sounds of someone making tea in a strange house, as if it were not strange at all. She thought about what Donald was sitting with right now. Not just the numbers, though the numbers were staggering in their own right. The deeper thing. He had spent 3 months in Clay County at the end of Irene's life, managing her affairs, securing her assets, making sure that what the family had accumulated went where he needed it to go. He had been thorough, and he had been present, and he had missed, completely and entirely, the one piece of it that mattered most. Because Emmett had kept it separate, and Emmett had been smarter than anyone had given him credit for, and Frank had bought out Donald's half of scrubland for $4,000 in cash, and Donald had taken the money without ever once driving out to see what he was signing away. Greed paired with carelessness produces exactly this. The thing you worked so hard to take, and the thing you let go for nothing, and one of them was worth 100 times the other, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing which was which. Sheila called 2 days later. Her voice was different from its usual register, no smoothness, no managed warmth. She asked if there was any possibility of revisiting the question of the family assets in light of the discovery. Ellie said, "The cellar is on land Frank owned outright. He put the deed in my name in 2021. There's nothing to revisit." Sheila said she understood, in a tone that suggested she did not understand, and the call ended shortly after. Ellie did not gloat. There was nothing in her that wanted to. What she felt was something quieter and more durable than satisfaction, a sense of things having arrived where they were supposed to, through a set of choices made by a man she'd never met, refined by a man she had loved for 44 years, and completed by her own willingness to go where the brass key pointed. She thought about Emmett in 1961, taking the photograph in front of the barn, writing on the back of the frame, "For whoever finds this place." He had not written, "For whoever deserves this." He had not written, "For my family." He had written, "For whoever finds this place." And the word whoever was doing all the work. It meant the person who came, the person who opened the door, the person who showed up. She had shown up. Carla Fugate filed the land claim paperwork in Boone County at the end of August, and the county recorder's confirmation came back in October. 340 acres of Hartwell land, titled to Eleanor Hartwell. The mineral rights lease negotiations with 2 energy companies began in November, with Carla representing Ellie's interests with the focused tenacity of a woman who had spent 30 years ensuring that rural Kentucky landowners were not undercut by companies with teams of attorneys and long experience at doing exactly that. The coin collection was placed with a Louisville auction house in the spring. The single-owner provenance, the documented cellar storage, and the condition of the St. Gaudens pieces drew a level of interest the auction house said was unusual even for collections of this size. The sale closed at $1.7 million. Ellie paid her attorney. She paid the accountants. She paid David back for the flights he'd taken to help her through it, though he told her she didn't need to. She put a meaningful amount in accounts for her 2 granddaughters. She had the farmhouse at Creel's Crossing assessed by a structural engineer who confirmed what she had already known. The bones were sound. She hired a restoration crew from Lexington to begin the work of bringing the house back, with Cary Oaks as the local contact who knew the property and the county and every supplier within 30 miles. She did not sell the mineral rights outright. She negotiated a lease arrangement that provided annual income without permanent extraction rights, which meant the hill above the property remained intact and the land remained hers. Carla called it an unusually good deal. Ellie called it what it actually was, which was what Emmett had wanted when he'd refused to sign the 1953 papers, which was that the hill would still be there after the business was done. She kept the promissory notes from Emmett's tin box, the ones marked forgiven, the small loans to Depression-era neighbors whose families were probably still in Boone County. She had Beverly at the county recorder's office help her trace the descendants of the 3 families named on the notes. 2 of the 3 were still in the area. She drove out and met them separately, brought the notes and explained where she'd found them, and told them she thought they should have them. She didn't make anything of it. She just thought they should know that someone had helped their grandparents through a hard time and kept the record not as a claim, but as a fact of human history that deserved to be known by the people it involved. Both families cried. She wasn't prepared for that and didn't know what to do with it, so she just sat with them until it passed. In the spring, when the restoration crew had gotten the roof sound and the windows replaced, and the porch rebuilt with timber milled from fallen oak on the property, Ellie brought a rocking chair out from the farmhouse and set it at the top of the porch steps and sat there in the early April morning with her coffee. The apple trees were budding. Cary had told her that with proper pruning they'd produce well again by fall. They were old trees, but good ones, the kind that come back strong when someone gives them what they need. She'd said she'd never pruned an apple tree in her life, and he'd said it wasn't complicated and had given her a lesson the previous weekend that she'd found genuinely absorbing in the way that learning a physical skill is absorbing when the skill is real and practical and rooted in something that will last. She had the brass key on the table beside her. She picked it up sometimes, turned it over in her fingers. The initials E.H. in the barrel. Emmett Ray Hartwell, who had put things away for the right person and trusted that the right person would come, and who had been correct about that in a way that still felt, to her, like a conversation across 60 years between two people who had never met. She thought about Frank, about his letter, the apology in it, the honesty of a man finally setting down something he'd carried a long time. She thought about the morning at the kitchen table after the funeral when the cardinal had come to the feeder and she hadn't been able to name what she felt. She could name it now, or most of it. It was grief and love and the particular weight of a life well shared, and underneath all of it the thing she hadn't yet known to look for it was trust. Frank had trusted her with this, not because he had no choice, but because she was the one he trusted most. He'd said so himself, at the bottom of the third page, in the slightly looser hand. You were always the braver one. She sat on the porch of Emmett Hartwell's farmhouse in Boone County in the April morning with her coffee going warm in her hands, and the apple trees going through their slow, reliable return, and the cellar door beneath the barn stood open behind her. She had not closed it since the day she'd first pulled it toward her. She didn't intend to close it. Some doors, once opened, are not meant to be sealed again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.